Hey, what up? What up? This is KB. I use they and them pronouns, and I am here joined by Shane. And we'll be talking just a little bit informally about how language connects and disconnects us. Now, Shane, me and you have had a lot of kind of like conversations just in passing about this, but thought it'd be cool to have it recorded and see, if it may be fruitful for folks that are looking. So themes that we'll cover things like race, gender, disability, sexuality, and mental health. So yeah, let's get into it.
All right.
I already said my name and pronouns, but go ahead and give an intro for yourself, Shane.
Yeah, so I'm Shane Whalley. My pronouns are Z, here, and here's. I'm a white, non-binary um, person with mixed ability status who tries to walk in the world as consciously as I can.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And it's good that you kind of brought other identities into the room because a lot of our conversation would be about how we came into those identities and what those identities mean to us. So I can start really with I guess my stuff. So I use they them pronouns. I am non-binary and I identify as Black American, and also mixed disability status. And I came really into like calling myself Black American because race and ethnicity for a lot of reasons just get like mixed up, right? Like racially, I don't think anyone would look at me and not see me as Black, right? So Black is kind of the catch-all term that I feel most aligned with. Some people use African American, and some people use other terms, Afro American even. And I put American after that, which is kind of more connotating ethnicity and like contextualizing my Blackness, because the Black American experience is different than that of the Black Mexican experience, which is also different than that of people in other countries and in locations. So yeah, yeah, non-binary specifically is a term that I started using really as soon as I like even knew it was a thing. So like probably 2017 slash 2018, I had a non-binary friend and I was trying to be respectful as in like not bombarding them with questions, right? So I just looked stuff up on my own time and was like, oh, so that's what this is and this exists. That is exactly the language that I'll start using now because it just felt like I've always felt as if, she, her pronouns or he, him pronouns, or like the idea of someone looking at me and thinking I'm a girl or the opposite of that, just didn't always feel right. Right. So then I learned other terms like gender queer and all of these other kind of terms on this kind of like non-man, non-woman spectrum, but non-binary felt like again the most like inclusive catch-all term for me. And some days I do like question that, like, as language is more so evolving, will that change? I think it's fine if it does. It's very fluid in that way, but I guess I'll start there.
Yeah, I think the non-binary thing is interesting, right? Because one of the things we didn't talk about is age, right? So one of
Mm,
the ways that we're different, right, is I'm 60. I came out around being non-binary in the mid 90s when we didn't have any language, right? So I identified as living in the gender gray, and then I strongly identified as gender queer for a long time, and probably still do, but that sometimes needs an explanation, and non-binary doesn't. I think one of the things that's been interesting for me, right, is where I change my language and where I don't. So I use he, here, his pronouns because those were the pronouns that were around as I was coming up. And I often struggle with whether I should use they, them because it would be easier for others, but it doesn't resonate for me. And so I think there's always the place with language of where I am willing to give, right, and where I kind of dig dig my feet in and ask other people to do some do some work. um so I'm curious, KB, I think it's interesting, right? Like, I'm always going to get read as white. I am white, right? But I never have to say I'm a white American, right? I don't have to claim white American if I ran around saying I was a white American, or if I was said I was a British Danish American, which would be my right my ethnicity from my lineage, right? People would kind of look at me twice and wonder why I do that. Um, and so it makes me I don't know what the emotion is, sad, angry, frustrated, irritated, that you have to say you're Black American when the Black part also is evident, right? And that you can't just identify as American if you wanted to. And I don't think and we often just use it, American as code for white if it doesn't have a disclaimer. And that's jacked up.
Yeah, I think it's honestly like a lot due to the fact that anti-blackness is global, right?
Mhm.
Like no matter where you are, at least I have not heard of any places that don't deal with kind of anti-blackness.
Mhm.
And I think that the experience of anti-blackness is different depending on what country you're in. For all intents and purposes, like when I'm talking, I don't know, outside of a formal whatever setting, I will just say that I'm Black. I put Black slash African American, which is usually how it's listed on all of the forms, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I guess yeah, the qualifier of American to me is just me like connotating the specific experience of blackness that I have. Because I just can't speak to right like the immigrant experience, or I can't speak to all of these other experiences of blackness. And yeah, like I can never, I probably wouldn't even feel comfortable just saying American, because American always is connotated as white.
Yeah.
Anything where people don't say their race, it is assumed that it's white, right? Because
Yeah.
white is kind of seen as default, but
Right.
it's a whole thing.
It is a whole thing.
And I liked what you kind of brought up about language of like kind of gender diversity changing over time. Because it's been my experience that, especially as I've kind of gotten farther into medical transition stuff, I don't know, I like take HRT and I've had top surgery, right? And I feel like it would probably be easier for people to just use he, him, or like he, they pronouns for me, with like using he most of the time. And I've thought about that a lot. Like, should I just change my pronouns? Because like though he, him pronouns don't feel right for me, they probably would be easier. But I'm just like, no, I'm not gonna like compromise that, because like I see myself as not having a gender, right? And there are so many different ways that people can even uh, identify within like gender non-binary. What do you call it? The spectrum, right? Of anything that's not like cis man, cis woman. Um, and I have friends that are just like, I feel like it depends on the day for me, right? Like I mostly feel like a girl, but not always. I'm more so like, when you see me, I just do not want you to see a gender. And non-binary is the closest that I can get to that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think that's a place where we are similar, right? Like if you woke up, if I woke up tomorrow and somebody said you have to be a woman today, I'd be like, I don't know how, right?
Exactly.
And I would do it badly. And if you told me to be a man, I would just say no thank. I would say no thank you. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think the non-binary space, especially I think for folks who either gender on the binary side just don't resonate at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's an interesting space to be in, and people who aren't in that space I think have a hard time, wrapping their head around it. I've
Mm-hmm.
been told you can't be non-binary, that right, like it's not possible, and I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
you're negating like 25 years of my life, so please don't.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Yeah.
So
There's definitely this urge, and it maybe stems from white supremacy, of just like flattening things to like this or
yeah,
that, right? Like male or female or black or white, when it's just like so much of our lives are flexible, and you deny that flexibility, and you also deny like people's humanness. Even male and female is just not a correct or appropriate binary, right? Because we have folks that don't, have the characteristics like synonymous with that of a male, that of female, right? Intersex people exist, and it's still, legalized for so many people to discriminate against them in the medical field. And it's also like, I don't know, I guess like the medicalization of gender has kind of like also messed up people's minds around it. They're just like, this is like synonymous with genitals. And it's like, no, gender is very much something that's socialized, right? Like you are socialized to believe that you are like, it's a girl means nothing. Like, I don't know, at least to me at a birth, it's like, it's a girl. It's like, well, I don't know, right? Um, and with language changing over time, I like that for you, it sounds like you using, Z, here, here's pronouns is kind of you tethering yourself to that history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. And also making space for others, right, who still use those pronouns. I know young people, right? Like I know young people who use those pronouns. I'm not a unicorn. I'm not a unicorn in that. So, um, and I think the pronouns really have developed right? They've developed over time. And I personally feel that they, them, their came into being to make it easier. And I'm not about that. So um, to make to make it easier or more comfortable for others at my expense on a daily basis doesn't it's worth the fight for me to stay in it. So yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And I I guess I want to think about like, why do we use the language that we use and not other terms, in the sense of like why I would use Black American, not African American, or why you would use, I don't know, whatever other kind of terms that you use around disability even.
Mhm.
Um, like for me, I think that I've been in a lot of conversations where people are scared to say Black and they say African American instead. So it just like reminds me of that, like when I hear African American. And I also feel a little weird about saying it personally, not because any biases I have around Africa, but like no ties in my family due to slavery, right? Like, do I have to Africa as a continent, right? Like the oldest, I guess, ancestor that I know about that my family has records of um, was a slave. And their last name was changed. And that was a kind of way of erasing kind of like all of that history that happened before then. So I'm just like, I'm just kind of reminded of whiteness when I hear African American, but I also am not, I guess, like judgy about people that use that term for themselves, because I think that especially terms that have been used, or what do you call it, projected upon Black people, I guess we are allowed to use them however we want.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important that people get to use the language that most resonates with them, one. And two, though, right, like how consciously, I think some of us very consciously choose our language every day, right? And because of colonization and because of anti-Blackness and because of oppression, there are people who use the language that they hear the most, but don't necessarily question and think about what it means to them or how they feel about it, right? So I always enjoy being in conversation about how people choose their language, or if they're just taking kind of the path of least resistance because that's what they see on a form, right? And the language that I have to check on a form often doesn't resonate with how the language that I use for myself in conversation with people.
Exactly. And I like that you bring that up, because it's like forms are often not synonymous with like just the reality of people's lives. And I also think you can know all of this social justicey kind of language around gender and sexuality and not like practice that, right?
Right.
Unfortunately, I see sometimes a distance between theory and practice, in the communities that I've worked in the job titles that I've had, where I'm just like, you know, all of the terms, you know, all of the appropriate terms to use, but like, do you know why we're using these terms? Do you know why it's important to call, I don't know, people instead of girlfriend, boyfriend, partner, which is a term that you know, it's more or less popular now, but I'm just like, do you even really know why you're using that? Right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I remember when partners started getting used by heterosexual or straight people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when that very first happened, I was I'd get confused sometimes because I'd be like, I thought you were straight,
Yeah.
right? Like I thought about
Yeah.
that as a term within the queer community, right?
Right.
And now I've grown to very much appreciate how it gets used and why it gets used. But I
Mm-hmm.
think um yeah, I mean, when I was young, if I had called somebody black, right, like that would have been not okay at all for a
Mm-hmm.
white person to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and now it's pretty, much more common. So yeah, it changes and evolves, and we have to keep, think part of the work, right? We say
Mm-hmm.
social justice, we always talk about the work, but we never define it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but part of the work, right, is keeping up with that. I appreciated that kind of difference between academic language and of social justice language that don't always dovetail, and then individual and community language, right? And the language
Mm-hmm.
that you might use uh, with the Black Trans Leadership Group might be different, right, than the language that you're going to use in a different, in a workshop of mainly white people. Um, and so, yeah. And I know sometimes people say, well, it's a lot to keep track of. And I'm like, there's so much privilege in that statement if you don't want to do the
Mm-hmm.
work, right, to keep up.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, some of us don't have a choice. I'm also thinking about gatekeeping language and how sometimes I feel as if, as a Black person, like people will co-opt Black language and like make it into a spectacle almost. There's a lot of like conversation around like what do you call it, digital blackface,
hmm,
where people will use gifs and memes and things like that of Black people to kind of take some kind of strong emotion. I think
hmm,
about that and how similar that is to like using Black sense around Black people, you know, talking in ways that you normally would not, right? Just because you're
hmm,
around a Black person. Um, and I don't know, at times when people give pushback about those things to non-Black people, they'll be like, oh, it's just social media language, or you know, it's pop culture language. And I'm like, so Blackness, to you, Blackness is synonymous with pop culture and you're trying to like kind of dilute that. But I'm just like, you know, how acceptable is it to, you know, use this kind of like slang? And like I feel like, you know, things like AAVE, African American Vernacular English, and Ebonics exists because, you know, Black people are doing these kind of poetic, I would think, and like interesting things with the English language that was imposed on us. And now it's just like, oh, that's social media language. And it's just like, what happens when people outside of these communities get access to this language and then dilute it, you know?
right. Or monetize it, right? Like,
Right.
or making money off of stuff that isn't theirs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think a lot about, I think some of that is happening in queer culture,
Mm-hmm.
with queer culture as well, right?
Yeah, I think of terms like top and bottom even. That were used in specific, or like switch, or all of those kinds of terms too, which were specifically kind of used in queer context. At least that's how I saw them. And then now they're kind of like just more general usage,
Mhm.
and like some queer terms as well that you would probably see on Paris is Burning, and that I've heard since I was a very little kid. People just say them now, and I'm just like, this is interesting, you know? I don't know what else to say besides this is
What is
interesting.
interesting code for, KB? Like, interesting is code for, like, Probably stronger language.
right. Like if that kind of language, right, is only talked at to me, I'm just like, feels like you're using a black accent with me because I'm black and I don't like that. But when it's just like that's your whole personality and that's how you talk and you're not black, I'm just like, or you're not queer. I'm always like, this gives me pause, but I'm not sure what to do with it, you know?
Yeah.
Um,
Are you somebody, let's see if I can ask this question differently. The whole kind of calling in or calling out or questioning people on why they're doing things. Are you somebody who will engage in that conversation with folks? And how well do you feel like you need to know them in order to do that?
that's a good question. For me, it is on a case by case basis, like how I would respond. But if in that moment I am feeling like I will talk to you more than once, like just in my life, um, and also in that moment, I feel like I have the education necessary to like continue with the conversation, then I probably will ask questions. Usually, the way that I engage in conflicts, right, around language is I'll ask a question, and I'll be like, "So why do you think that way?" Just like earlier today, geez, I was having a conversation with my dad, and he used this term for transgender people that is outdated, right? And in that moment, I was just like, oh, so like we don't say that anymore. We say trans people, right? And that's my dad. So of course I'm gonna feel a little bit more comfortable with doing that there.
Yeah.
But if it was somebody, say a friend of a friend, that said some kind of slur, I'd be like,
Your sound cut out.
oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, now you're back.
Okay, I don't know what happened. Maybe I touched the keyboard and it did something weird, but I think I'm more so of a question asker. Like when it's not someone that I feel super familiar with, 'cause questions I guess um, I feel as if people will get less defensive if I'm asking them questions to make them think about what it is that they're saying. And then, right, if I have the education, I will give it. But like I said just a second ago, we're talking about people that use like black sense or like use this kind of like queer slang or something, and they're not a part of those communities. It usually gives me pause because I'm not always sure what to say in the moment.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Yeah. I often ask people what they mean by things because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes they don't they don't know, right? Like they heard it
Mm-hmm.
and so they think they can use it. And
Mm-hmm.
maybe they heard it out of context, right? So then that kind of bad behavior goes
Mm-hmm.
forward. Um, so uh yeah, I agree. I think I'm with you on I do this with pronouns too, right? Like, or if I get misgendered, if it's a barista at a coffee shop that I'm never going to see again, I'm just going to let it go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's energy I don't need to spend. But if
Right.
I'm going to see you again, right, or if I'm going to be in any type of relationship with you, then I'm going to, right, kind of do the work, take the risk. I think people don't realize that the energy and risk it takes when we
Mm-hmm.
correct around our own identities, right? Because we don't
Mm-hmm.
know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen, whether it's
Mm-hmm.
mild or whether it's violent, right? Like that
Mm-hmm.
spectrum of what the reaction can be, we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes I'm like, I'd rather just have one piece of discomfort than like a long conversation of discomfort.
Right.
But that gets wearing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I think it's just so much fatigue that is put on marginalized people or that marginalized people have when we feel like we have to have these conversations all the time because it's not normalized. And I'd love to live in a world where like they them pronouns, though I feel like we have been getting closer to that. We are definitely still not there. Like a world where they them pronouns is he here pronouns and basic stuff around like gender and sexuality was like normalized.
Right.
It's not the world we live in, so a lot of times, yeah, it takes this extra kind of like explaining. and yeah, I don't always have time for it or like need for it, but I think that language can connect us. Going back to the title, language can connect us in the sense that, like, if we are going to be in a relationship with each other and I say something like about what you said, like that hurt my feelings, or that's not the verbiage that I use for myself, I think that can make us stronger, make our connection stronger, because on the other side of that conversation means like we understand each other more, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think I would like to live in a world, which we don't live in, where we actually talk about language, our identity language, right? Like we've gotten to the point where I think for a lot of us, we now introduce ourselves and give our pronouns, right? But we don't often talk about, I don't think you introduce yourself and say, you know, I'm KB, I use they, them pronouns, I'm a Black American, I have mixed, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
but then like I asked when we were kind of prepping for this, I asked you specifically around how you the language you used around race and ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I would love to do that more with people
Mm-hmm.
who don't look like me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I've been so socialized that it's taboo to do.
Yeah.
Um, and I would like that taboo to change.
Yeah. I'd like culture to be less like, awkward conversations are the worst. So we're just gonna assume things about people or not engage in any conflict, no matter how much damage that causes long term.
Right.
I absolutely would love us to move towards conflict because it makes us closer to each other once we can get on the other side of it, or even towards like, awkward uh, introduction. Well, I don't know. Names and pronouns are not awkward introductions to me at this point. But if
No.
somebody asks me like, what terms do you use around race? I'd be like, I'm Black. What terms do you use around race and ethnicity? I'm Black American, and I would have no, problem with it because I'd rather use that than to assume, right?
Right.
Assumptions, I think, create more problems.
Every day. Yeah.
More problems every day. I mean, that'd be a whole nother talk, really. But
Yeah.
I'd love to like also talk about like how the rigidity, how being rigid around language could harm things like classrooms, workspaces, organizing like collectives and things like that.
And when you say rigid, what do you mean by that?
As in, like, okay, so you're non-binary, you use they them pronouns, like that's it, or like they're only man and woman, like things like that.
Yeah, I think even in kind of organizing space, social justice organizing spaces, right? We
Hmm.
can get hung up on language and we don't get any work done. Right? Like we can get in a big fight around um so again, there's a generational piece to
Hmm.
trans language, right? Around so when I was coming up, we talked about male to female and female to male. We don't use that language right? We don't use that language anymore. But there
Hmm.
are people of an age who might still use it because it's the language that they came out with, right?
Hmm.
And I've heard elders get called out for being like, you can't use that language anymore. And it's like,
Hmm.
wait, wait a minute. Like you wouldn't exist if I hadn't existed and used that language at some point. So it's
Yeah.
like, how do we move things forward and honor the historical pieces and be curious about how we got to where we are? So I think the rigidity,
Hmm.
I've just been in spaces where the agenda for the day never happened because we've gotten in kind of word wars, which I I think if they're conversations, they can be powerful. I think if they're word wars, then it stops us from making the real right. Like we have to change more than language to get to equity
Yeah.
and humanity and justice. And yet I find in a lot of places that that's the place we often get stuck.
Yeah, I agree. when we don't have a shared glossary, things can become just very hostile. I've seen, at least, because there are so many variations, right? Like, someone can feel the exact same way as I do about gender and identify as gender queer. And I don't think that they are wrong, and I don't think that I am wrong. Two things can be true at once,
What?
right?
Are you sure?
It's just like, is non-binary trans or not? Or
Yeah.
are neurodivergent people disabled or not? And what are the right pronouns to use for non-binary? Like, it's just, what
Right.
about, what if there wasn't a right answer? What if there were multiple answers and all of those depend on the individual?
And
Right.
context, right?
Yeah,
Right. Like,
I agree.
I was been in a conversation recently around disability and the difference between person first language and identity first language, right? And I know people who feel very strongly on both sides of that, right? Whether you say, um, I am a blind person or I'm a person who is blind, right? And it depends on how important that part of the identity is to that person, often, right? Like what that order is. And again, it's not up to me to
Mm-hmm.
police
Mm-hmm.
how somebody talks about themselves, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that that even bleeds over to conversations on transness. There's so much overlap with transness and disability conversations, I think, but woman of trans experience versus trans woman, or man of trans experience versus trans man, like, it's just like, I go along with whatever language someone uses for themselves. And as long as the language is not upsetting, like problematic,
Mhm.
right? Then, like, what are we doing here, around like being right and being wrong? I think that
Right.
language is fluid, and it's always been fluid ever since English was kind of forced upon a lot of us, right? We've
Right.
all been just doing the same, like, doing different things with our English, right? Like, my English is going to be different than that of someone. I grew up in Texas. It's going to be different than that of someone who grew up in Pennsylvania. And that just is what it is. Language is regional. And I think that there is no right way to a lot of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to listen, right,
Hmm.
to what people use. We get to ask. I'm a big fan of asking what words mean to me, right? So I identify as queer.
Hmm.
Queer now actually is much more accepted than it was when I started using it 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, when I used it, so many people said you can't call yourself that, it's a negative term. And I'm like, you straight person in particular don't get to tell me I don't get to call myself that, right? And then that, the word queer has evolved over time. So I appreciate if somebody just asks me like, oh, you use queer, what is that? Why do you use that, or what does that mean to you? Instead of saying what is the definition of that and using me like a human dictionary, right? Like, I don't want to be Shane's Merriam-Webster dictionary, but I do want to tell stories about why I choose the language I use.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I think that we also have to check our ageism at the door. Like, honestly, in queer and trans spaces especially, it's just a little bit of like, this is my idea and this is my idea and it's different, so it's bad. And I'm just like, I mean, yes, language changes over time, and someone should not, like, I don't know, mispronoun you based on what they have known historically. But I also think you can't tell people that the language that they use for themselves is wrong. Um, yeah, like, FTM is still very much used, and MTF is still very much in circulation, right? So
Right.
it's just like, I'm not about to tell somebody that that's wrong. When I tell someone that something is wrong, it is likely someone from outside of the community that is using a slur. As
Right.
far as I know, that is not a slur. So we're not doing that, right? Like, usually in those conversations, I'm like, no,
Right.
let's move on, you know?
And I am going to take note when I hear that it is not what the community, the younger community, right? It's not, as things are transitioning, sometimes I can be behind on the movement, right? and that I'm going to listen to and be curious about and ask for education, or I'm going to Google it and look it up, right? Um, yeah, it's we're never going to get language right, right? Like
Hmm.
it's a work in pro. It's always going to be. Well, it's ever going to be a work in progress.
Yeah. Yeah. I just hope that we can use language, especially new language that comes into our lives and circulation, to more so connect us. Cause I mean, I remember the first time I heard non-binary and I just felt like, wow, there's finally a term for like how I feel. And that felt very me connecting like to myself.
Mhm.
And I want that for other people. Like I want them to stumble across language, maybe language that I don't even know, right? And I don't know. I feel like I was probably pretty abreast on these things when I was younger, but there is language, that is used that I'm not familiar with now. But I'm like, if it gives you that feeling that I felt, I want it for you, right? And also like giving people the opportunity to reclaim language, um, I think is really important, right? Um, Black people, right, like reclaiming nigga, right, which used to be very much a slur, and queer folks reclaiming queer. It's just like, do you want to be the person that tells us that we can't use something that was once used against us? I feel like that's not right, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's important that it's intercommunal, but I think it's important that we give people space to do those things.
Yeah. I mean, I often get asked, right, like why all the language, right? Like why do new words keep getting developed? And I think KB, it's exactly to what you said, is like we don't like labels, but we like language that resonates with our experience. And there's so many experiences. So there's always going to be, kind of new language. Sometimes I hear words, and demisexual would be an example of this. When I heard the definition, I was like, well, that experience has been around forever. Experience has been around forever, right? But nobody had named it, right? And so naming things is powerful. It's powerful for folks. So um, let's keep doing it, and then being curious, right? Like respectfully curious about where it comes from and what it means to people.
Yeah. And I think also just like being less intolerant around difference. I think that um, unless we're veering into the territory of people being harmful, it's fine to be different. Like, as long as we have the same fundamental understanding of like Black people are people and deserve, rights and liberties and justice like everybody else. And same thing for queer community, same thing for trans people, and same thing for disabled people. It's like whatever you call it, I don't care. As long as we're fundamentally on the same page, all the little differences. I think that actually I would not like to be around people that are completely the same as me. Like only hanging out with Black non-binary people from Texas would be just a hard life. Um, I think that also it would just, even within that, right? Like there is going to be difference because I have not lived the same life as somebody else. And I think that that is beautiful and that brings so much creativity to the work that often workplaces, classrooms, organizing like spaces are trying to do. We're trying to find creative ways to dismantle, harmful things, right?
Right.
Um,
Yep. And right, like I don't I think we need to work to find common ground. And I don't mean that in a Pollyanna way, like we need to do that and pretend that the difference doesn't exist, right? But if we're always only looking for the difference and not finding, right, like on paper, you and I have a lot of identities that are different, right?
mhm,
And we have some common goals, I think, on what we would like the future to look like, right?
right.
And so how do we learn to understand and respect, trust, and love how we're different, and then build on what it is we're trying to do, right?
Hmm. Hmm. And so much of like far left politics, which like I don't know, that's my context, so I guess I'm using that as an example. But so much of far left politics is like rooted in like collectivism and like these ideas that we need to stop being so individualist. But I'm like, so in order for collectivism to work, we have to be more tolerant towards difference, and we
Mhm.
have to be more willing, having patience, right, for each other, and like willing to do, exactly what you were just saying, which is like finding that common ground. But that doesn't mean, right, like, hey, white supremacists, like, let's find common ground, and the common ground will end up just being a very washed down version of like, wow, we have, Maya Angelou on the nickel now or whatever. It's just like, no, we
Don't
actually,
undervalue her. It's quarter, my friend.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm just like, who's on the other side of that quarter though? I don't know. Like,
Probably some white man is on the other side of that quarter,
it's
right?
like, I don't want to dilute progress, because
Right.
progress absolutely needs to happen, and we need to have a stand on something. Like being this like kind of apolitical centrist, it does nothing. But I'm thinking like maybe the common ground is that both of us believe, police, should not be killing people, right? And how are we both going to come together and be creative and then have patience with each other to figure out what the next thing is going to be?
Right.
Um,
Right.
yeah.
And the reason that we believe that is different, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I believe it because I've been tracking and following the history.
Mm-hmm.
My sense is you believe it because your community is at risk every day. You are at risk when you leave your home, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, it's political and
Mm-hmm.
personal because of that. For you, it's right, it's personal.
Mm-hmm.
And that we also, I think, need to be able to hold kind of that duality
Right.
in a way too, right? Like I can fight for that, and yet it doesn't impact my personhood in the same way that it impacts your personhood, right?
Right. And acknowledging that, I think, is very important, because we can't outgrow our context. Like, no matter how many books we read, no matter how much social justice language you picked up, you cannot outgrow your context. So, like, a lot of times I see white people kind of separating themselves from whiteness. And it's like, that is just how you go through the world. I mean, you can't act like that's not there. Right. Just like, I cannot act like, you know I'm ever going to be impartial about abolition, or I'm ever going to be impartial about policing, because it is just like tethered to my experience of the world. um but I think we can talk about that, and then we talk about that difference, and maybe that leads us to similarity and connection, right?
Yeah.
um yeah, I don't know, I'm thinking that I just want, even after all of the years that I've lived in this life, and I should be so jaded, I'm like, when someone asks me, do you believe, that the government will change, or do you believe in America, blah, blah, blah. Like, my answer is always that I believe in us. I believe in individual power to tether ourselves better to each other, to figure out our intercommunal issues, to change culture individually, because though, that's not policy change is not the only change that can change someone's life, right? And I think that, you know, language can be a very useful tool for catalyzing that kind of cultural shift. Like, there can be a world in which some of these things that we really desperately don't want to happen, like, don't happen. Um, and I think that starts with like conversation, right? And like not ending the conversation when, Shane uses he her pronouns and I use they them, right? You
Right.
know,
And now we're done. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
What are the repercussions of ending that conversation, um, and not finding a bridge?
Yeah. Right. And I think the other piece for me I've just been thinking a lot about is, really thinking about what is it that I do want instead of always focusing on what I don't want. Right. Because we can either try to be proactive at some point or we can always be reactive. And the reactivity isn't working. And so I'm hoping that if we can get some momentum toward being proactive and really dreaming for what policing can look like, or what connection across difference can look like, then we have a goal that we can work toward.
Yeah, yeah, and that takes goal setting and like mutual goal setting and consensus, where it's like this can't just work for all the they thems and that's it, or this can't just work when we make an LGBT center for all the cis gay dudes. Like it has to work for multiple people,
Right.
right? And I think that a lot of what organizing has been historically, like civil rights era organizing, LGBT rights organizing, like earlier days, a lot of that stuff, you know, we can learn from, right? Or at least, me with my kind of like newer context or newer ideas about like what could work in the place of what we have. Like if policing ended, like what could work there. I can look back in history and see what didn't work. And I think across a lot of things, and people may disagree with me here, but like across a lot of things, it was a lot of, single issue organizing. And that can only go so far. Or within that single issue, it was a lot of the black men are going to take precedent type things. Black cisgender men are going to take precedent, or LGBT rights. The cisgender gay and lesbian folks are going to take precedent, and it's like that kind of stuff. Again, like when you gain something, if the black trans people in the community, if like black women in the community are not also like being cared for, advanced, then like what are we doing? You know what I mean?
Yeah. We've left a lot of people at bus stops,
Right,
right? Saying
right,
like, we'll swing by and pick you up on the next round. And
exactly.
guess what? Most of those people are still sitting at
Right,
bus stops waiting to be picked up, right? Like,
right.
um, yeah, identity politics is gonna kill all of us.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
with
yeah,
any, unless we don't have any historically or currently oppressed identities, right? So yeah,
right.
hopefully we're learning, right? I'm going to try to take a little bit of your optimism and hope, right, that is the case. Um, yeah.
Yeah,
So I'm a little mindful of how long we've been chatting, which I
it's true.
appreciate.
It's true. It's
Um,
true.
I wanna, so are you at a place where maybe I can ask a final question and we can kind of tie up our thoughts? Okay. Um, so the one of the things I'm always interested in when I'm having these conversations is like, what's the one thing or question that you just need to have stop, right?
Mm,
Like, what is it that uh, if we could wake up tomorrow and you never had to talk about it again, would give you some time and space to do other things. And again, thinking since we've been kind of resting in the language space.
hmm Probably a thing that would make my life a lot easier is when I am explaining new language, right? Quote unquote, language that is new to somebody that I'm speaking to,
Mhm.
um, around race or gender or sexuality or disability. Um, like having to answer the question preemptively, like, why does this matter?
Mhm.
I think would save a lot of the rest of my life because I'm like, ooh, the way that I think now even I feel like I'm on autopilot. Like I just answer that question without people even asking because I feel like I've had people ask it enough to where I'm like, I have to say why this is important. But if I didn't, if people just cared about things that were, different than maybe their experience, if people already were like, oh, great, new language, as in new ways of connection with other people, like if we looked at language and building our language bank as a thing that is good, I wouldn't have to answer that question. And I wouldn't have to kind of justify my personhood in a way. So,
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
about you?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Like, having to kind of fight, right? Like, I, so yes, I agree with that. Yeah, I think I may just I think I may just be like, yes, KB, right? Because I think that, like, well, why is that, right? And always having to, again, I don't, I don't always get to be in proactive conversations because I'm having to be in defensive conversations. And
Mm-hmm.
if we could, which doesn't move us forward. So
Mm-hmm.
yes. And then maybe the last thing we want to do is to share how we do this work, like what the name we do this work under, and
Yes.
what our social media is. So um, you can find me at Daring Dialogues Consulting, or on Instagram, which I don't use as political space, and Twitter, which I do use as political space. I'm at Gender in Blender. Um,
Yes.
and KB, where can people find you?
Yes, I am earth2kb.com. I want to say, love that at name. When I first saw it, I was like, I wish I would have thought of this. But my little sector of the internet is earth2kb.com. And then on all social medias, I'm at earth2kb.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, I thank you and appreciate the conversation and time.
Yeah. Yeah. I appreciate you too. And hopefully,
To
folks,
be continued.
yeah. Yeah, TBD. All right, TTYL.